Yo guys, and welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are doing fantastic as usual. And we're straight back into this to-do application that we are creating together. So what have we got implemented so far? Well, we've got this amazing list rendering here. It was pretty easy, we got this data structure. We also created this interface, in fact, where we had some simple getting started properties. We're probably gonna fill up with a whole lot more here in the future, but this is a good starting point, I feel like. And then we got this array, so we're just rendering this array to the screen, and it's super straightforward in my opinion. So we made some great progress in the last episode. If you haven't watched that, feel free to watch it. Since this is kind of a series, you could come in from any point in time, but it's kind of good if you get some context, since the point of these episodes is that you should be creating your own to-do application. And, if you don't have the whole picture, then it might actually be a good idea to watch the whole series. But if you just want to learn something from this video, then feel free to do that, of course. You don't have to do practical coding if you don't want to. So you can just use this as your Svelte learning material, because I will be trying to teach you, I will be trying to explain my thoughts process. I'm no Svelte expert, as I said previously, so you'll probably catch me making some mistakes, and that is kind of part of the process, It is important for me to show you guys that no one is perfect, and we all struggle sometimes, and that is definitely true in the world of software development. So it's even more important that you should not feel ashamed of doing something wrong, or struggling, or sitting here looking at some error message and not understanding it. It's all part of the process. So what are we gonna implement today? Well, we've got this hard-coded list, and it's kind of a shame because we can't really deploy this application, unless whoever we are deploying it to has some very specific to-do list that just matches this and has buy some cookies twice, so we should probably add an option to actually create a to-do item. I think that is definitely super important. So let's do that. Let's create a new component here for creating an item, and that should be probably called to-do item create or something. So we've kind of got a theme going here with this to-do item prefix, and I think it's pretty good to keep, some convention, stick to some, way of naming your components so that it makes sense if someone else is supposed to read them. Or, in the future, in 1 week when you read this code back and you don't understand anything because you have all kinds of weird names. So let's add an input field here. So this will be the input field where the user types in the title here. So buy some cookies would be an example of what you could put in there. So let's create an input type text for that. And let's also add a placeholder so that the user knows what is expected to be typed in there. So create a new task or something like that. And that's pretty straightforward, I feel like. So let's think a second about where we want to put this component actually. So we currently have this to-do items.svelte, which we use to, render a list, an array. And it's definitely interesting here to think about the different responsibilities of each component. And the responsibility for this component is kind of to render these items. As the name suggests, to-do items.svelte, we are rendering the to-do items. But the real question here is, where do we want to put this array? Because this array will be used probably throughout the whole application, We probably want to edit tasks, and then we need to have access to that array. And of course, we want to delete them. We currently have that in to-do items.svelte. I don't know about the best practice of that, So it's definitely an interesting thought to think about here, because this to-do item create actually needs to have access to this array in some form or another. So we need to be able to, push an object to this array, of course, if we want to render a new item. So how do we want to do that? So let's actually have a moment of Googling here, because we want to find, the most easy to implement as well, the most easy and readable implementation. We shouldn't have to sit here and write and think and plan for 2 hours just to implement the best practice, but something that looks simple but also looks, performant, looks decent, looks popular, looks widely used, So let's Google something like Svelte. So there's actually something called Svelte Store, which is like a global a global state. So you can have this array variable part of this component, but instead you would actually span this out to the whole application. So the whole application actually has access to this array and is also reactive. So I could change this variable from another component and it would actually be reflected in this component as well. And it's super cool and super powerful. But the question here is what is the best practice regarding that? Because my personal opinion here is that it's pretty extreme to expose this array to like the whole application just because we want to use it. But this items array will probably be used in very many components actually. So Svelte store best practice. Let's do some Googling here. I think it's important. So working with Svelte stores. Don't use Svelte stores for small bits of data. Maybe not that one. Let's Google here. Store patterns. Provide structure. Vue.js. Where are we in Vue.js? Okay. So this is like for Vue developers, I assume. Let's see here. I know, like, this items does not feel that global to me. Something that would be global to me is probably like the authenticated user. So if you have like an authentication system, then I feel like, yeah, that would be like really unrelated. So like every component has something to do probably with the authenticated user, for example. But for this item, it feels pretty concrete, The responsibility is pretty concrete, but we need to span it out over multiple components if we actually want to create like a component-based design, because otherwise we could put everything in app.svelte, but then we wouldn't have the benefits of having components in the first place. So let's read this Mozilla page as well. The MDN are amazing when it comes to documentation. So here we can actually read, just like I said, but not all application state belongs inside your application's component hierarchy. So, for example, information about the logged in user or whether the dark theme is selected or not. That feels like a super concrete use case for stores. But, here is that, moreover, when your app becomes complicated and your component hierarchy gets complex, it might become too difficult for components to relate data between each other. And, is it that difficult really? That is the question I'm asking myself here. So it's important that we make good choices from the beginning, but, we shouldn't sit here, like thinking about this for way too long, because then we're not getting anything done and then we're kind of losing motivation over this problem. So if we're actually doing practical coding, we shouldn't be sitting here, full on thinking, planning ahead. We can always change this later, but we should make it kind of frictionless as possible, so that we don't have to like recode the whole application. So that is definitely like a risk if you do too much practical coding, that you end up doing like creating a big mess. So there's definitely like a fine line between actual traditional, super planned, well thought out coding and this more practical, hands-on stuff that I'm doing. But for our case, I think we could actually put this array in app.svelte for now and then just pass it around. I think that is probably the easiest way to do this right now. And, we still get the added benefits of having components. So why not do that? And let's do some logic in app.svelte. If our application grows, then we will actually maybe see a benefit of creating a store or doing it in another way. But for now, let's actually move this array to app.svelte. So now we can actually manage it from like the heart of the application, really. So let's just import that as well. And then we can just like bind it here. So we can bind the items so that we export it like a property. So we export it as a prop. So that's items, task array. And then we kind of have the same functionality, just that we have access to it from app.svelte instead. That's where we have the declaration, but we can still modify it. It will still be reactive, and then we can just put this to-do item create here instead. And then we could actually like do something. We could bind items here as well, maybe. Or is that really necessary? I think it's kind of overkill here to bind it here. Yeah, okay, maybe actually, yeah. if we want to have the logic tied to this component, all of these are kind of meta questions. I don't think there's like a super real answer. It all depends on your application and your use case here. But for this to do item create, I think, let's just bind it for now. It's the easiest way to do this. We could have like an event that we pass, like we could like dispatch an event from this component that we're creating a new item, and then we could have like a function here that does that on it. But for this, it kind of is nice to just, when I go and click on this to do item create, we get all the to do item creation functionality in one file. We don't have to go and look like in like 100 lines of code here, filter through that with our eyes. We just know that all of that logic is happening inside of this component. So I think that is pretty neat for now. If our application grows, then of course we can change it later. So there we are binding this array as well. And now when we, do something to it, we could actually like add something to this array. So that's pretty neat. We got that set up. And then let's bind it here, of course. So now we got that. And now it's being rendered. Isn't that amazing? So we can see it looks pretty bad actually. We kind of want this to span the whole web page width, since these items also do that. And we probably want to have some margin here. It's getting a bit tight. And probably a bit of padding as well. It looks pretty tight with the text there as well. So let's add that with our beloved isolated CSS. So if we do something like 10 pixels padding and then width 100%, so this should span the whole page width. And here we can actually see a problem, because this input actually spans more than the page width. And I think this is due to multiple issues really. So the default CSS for pages is to have some weird margin applied to the whole page. So if we remove that, I think we get a little bit closer to what we want. So if I were to remove this margin, we can see it kind of fixes our problem, because these items don't have that margin anymore. But if I add more margin, we can see it's still an issue. This still uses more width than we want it to do. It's not obeying our rules. And the reason for that, if I were to remove this padding, I think we can see it gets better, but I think it still has some internal padding or something. I'm not sure how this works for this input. But the reason, fundamentally is that this has, so the default value for the box sizing, this is something I recommend you to read more about, because I cannot explain it that well. But with this box sizing, the default value for this box sizing is to actually use more space. It makes up for space. So if I were to like add a border here, I add this very fat border of red, we can see it takes up more space than we told it to. It's already, you can see it like span out even more. We don't want that. If I tell this component, hey, I want you to be 100 pixels, if I check this now, we can see it's 140 pixels. This can definitely be confusing if you don't know about this. So the reason for that is the default value here for the box sizing is something, I'm not really sure what the actual default value, I think it's actually content box, so I think this is the default. Okay, it definitely isn't. Box sizing, well, maybe it's inherit or maybe it's initial. I guess it's initial. I'm not sure what that means really, but what we actually want it to be is box sizing border box. So this border box, I'm not sure about this naming actually, but if we check this out now, we can see that this input now actually, if I were to set width 100 pixels again, we can see now it is actually 100 pixels. We can actually see that it obeys our rules. So if I were to set this to width 100% again, there's no problem. We could add like 100 pixels border here. It would look completely ridiculous, but it would work, it would not use more width. So that is exactly what we want. So some people like to add this rule to every single element on the page. It's definitely something you can think about doing if you struggle with this issue a lot. But for me currently, I think like this is probably fine for now. If we run into this issue multiple times and we see, side effects of this, then we will just add it, But for now, let's just add like selectively. If we see it, we can add it. Otherwise, you can let it be, So let's remove all of this weird border. There we go. So now we can add some margin top here to make it a little bit less tight there. So if I were to add something like margin top 40 pixels, This is also something you can think about when it comes to isolating your components, because here we have this margin top. It kind of affects the layout of the whole page. I think the best practice is actually if we were to do this in the parent component, so actually in app.svelte. So I actually think it would be best practice to have like a divider here that pushes this down. So I don't know, maybe it's not best practice, but I feel like, of course these components should style themselves, but should they really be affecting the layout of the whole page? That's a question you can ask yourself. I think for now it's fine for us to do this. We just know like normally you would do this anyways, but when you get this component, you can get different thoughts about how extreme you want to be. There's always those who go to the absolute extreme and try to create it as isolated as possible, but we're doing practical coding here, so if we want to get anything done, then of course we are not going to be doing that. So let's change this to 30 pixels, I think, and that looks pretty decent, I think. So if I just have like a mobile layout, this also still looks fine. The only issue is probably if we definitely add more text here, then we will run into an issue. So we will be looking at making our page responsive in the future as well. That is super important, since a lot of users actually use the web on their phone, and that is definitely true for a to-do application. You're probably not going to be bringing like your whole desktop PC if you're going to write like a to-do, you complete a to-do. Even if you have like a laptop, it's kind of cumbersome, to bring up the laptop, bring up a web page just to complete the task. We could just pull up your phone and press a button and then you're done. So it's definitely super important to make your page responsive if you're gonna ship this somewhere, and probably for your own cause as well if you're not like super hardcore PC fan. So but for now let's keep it PC, but keep it in the back of our minds, not create like some super weird layout here maybe that we cannot make responsive. So let's actually add some functionality to this input field. So when we press the enter button, we want to submit this, whatever we write in here. And when we press the enter button, we want to submit that and actually create a new task. So the event I'm going to be using is called key down. So when a key, any key, all of these characters here are keys that this responds to, but so also the enter key, that is the key that we are looking to listen to whenever I press the enter key, we want to submit it. So let's actually add an event handler here. So on key down, we can see that amazing IntelliSense here. So on key down, no, we don't want to replace that. So on key down, then we want to create a new function, of course. So on key down, we pass in an event. I don't think I've shown you guys this, but all of these events, all of these vanilla events at least, they pass in, well, all of the events really, so all of the custom events as well. So all event handlers, they pass in like an argument. So they pass in the first argument here is the event. So this is actually the vanilla JS event that we can use to get the values from. So if I were to like console log this event here, we can see the vanilla structure here. So we can see we can get this target, we can get all of these properties exist on the vanilla event. So that is definitely like super cool of Svelte to not create some weird intermediary weird event. We just get the vanilla event. So that is a really beautiful thing of Svelte. They're not trying to like create a big wall between us and the DOM. They're keeping things real, and that's super reasonable, I think. So now we want to check if the enter key is being pressed, and we can actually annotate this. So I think this is called a keyboard event. So this is a keyboard event from the DOM, and we can also read some of the properties here. An important thing to note here is that there's actually, you can get fooled by this. So there's something called key code that is now deprecated. So the reason for this key code deprecation, I think, is because something called internationalization, where different keyboard layouts, different languages, they have different key codes. So the enter key might not have the same, for some reason. For some keyboards, I think the key code might be different for the enter key. But if we want to get the actual key, we get it from the key. So this returns actually a string. You might think, oh, the key code is more accurate, but actually the key is more accurate. So it might look a bit weird, but we're actually gonna check here if this is the enter key. So it's just a string. You can read about this on the internet. So keyboard event keys, we can check that out here. So see a full list of key values. We can check them all out here. That should contain the enter key as well. So enter, yeah. So the enter, sometimes label return. That works. So let's use that. And then we check that. So when I press the enter key now, we see a true appeared in our console. Isn't that amazing? So now we actually want to do an early return here. So that is something definitely worth thinking about when you're trying to keep your code as clean as possible. So we don't end up with a lot of nested if statements. So we can actually do an early return here. We don't need to continue with this function, unless it is actually the enter key. So we only want to continue with this function if it is the enter key. So if e.key isn't the enter key, then we want to return. Then this function stops executing. We are no longer doing anything. So that is pretty nice. Now we probably want to create a binding here. So since this is, the vanilla event, we could actually get the value here. So we could do something like e.target.value, and we would get the value here. So we can see whatever I typed here is actually being console logged here. But, I don't know how good practice this is actually, but it also looks pretty strange, like if we can just have a binding here, that beloved two-way data binding, then things are kept clean. We can have something like a variable. We could actually name the variable something, and it all makes much more sense, I think. So we could use the vanilla. Feel free to do that. It could actually be more performant. I'm not sure. Maybe, Svelte maybe adds some super small abstraction there, maybe creates a little bit of overhead for that two-way data binding. If they're not, then they're gods, but there might be like some performance gain of using it directly here. But let's keep our code clean actually. So let's do something like let title is an empty string, and then we can actually just bind that here. So bind the value to title. So now we have this two-way data binding, and now we could just reset it. So let's do that. That is, kind of the norm when you submit something, that the input field is being cleared. So whenever I press the enter button now, you can see that it disappeared. So now we actually want to create a new item here. So we can do that just by pushing to this array. So now that we have this items array bound here, we can actually modify it, and it should actually, result in this being re-rendered, or that we should see like a new item being appearing here. So let's try to do that. And something worth mentioning, I think I mentioned this like in the first episode or in the second episode, but when you push to an item, so you modify the state of the variable directly, Svelte doesn't know about it. For Svelte to react to it, for it to be reactive, we actually need to reassign the variable somehow. So just like I'm reassigning title here, we actually need to reassign items. So I could push this item here. I could push something like a task item here. So we can do something like one completed false, and then the title would of course be the title. I think we can actually do something like this. So this is probably like a shorthand in JavaScript where you can put, if it has the same key as it has the value, and we have of course the value is also a variable, then we can just write the key like here. We can put it like a value here, so the name is put here. Let's see if that works. So like I said, this should not be reactive, but if I were to log this items array, oh yeah, so if I were to log this items array, we can see that it actually contains 4 items. It actually contains this item. It's just that Svelte is not reactive. So one way to do this is by reassigning it to itself. It looks pretty strange. So if I were to reload it, yeah, that looks pretty nice. We got some adding capabilities. But now we can also see it complain. So like I said, with these keyed each statements, you really need to make sure that your key here is actually unique and that you're not creating something that's not unique. But another way to do this that looks a bit more clean is by using something called spreading. So if we just search that up real quick, we can read about it here. The spread syntax allows an iterable such as an array or string to be expanded in places where 0 or more arguments for function calls or elements for array literals are expected. So just like here, we can actually add a new item to this array. Yeah, okay, maybe not. We can actually do it like here actually. So here we're actually spreading something. We're spreading, yeah, okay. These examples were probably not the best for if you have not seen this before. I'm just gonna show it to you guys. But you can read about it here. You know, you got a whole story here. You can read all about it here. But with spreading, you can actually do something like this, where I spread these items and then we put this item here. We can see that this should have the same effect, but the difference here is that we're actually reassigning to this variable, so Svelte knows about it. So yeah, so we can see it's being added, but we still got this issue where it's not unique at all. So that's pretty good. We can see it looks pretty much, it doesn't look that good in my opinion, but it looks better than reassigning to itself. I'm not really sure if there's any like overhead here because we're like creating a new array. So I'm not sure if spreading has any overhead. We can search spread overhead. Does spread operator affect performance? We can see, as you can see, it actually has like a slight overhead, but so we don't really need to worry about these performance questions unless we really have a lot of data to worry about. You know, we got like 3 items here. This is done in a matter of nanoseconds, really. So this is really something. This is really overkill, and we should not be sitting here and thinking about this too much because we will be going crazy. So, you know, whatever is more readable, unless we have like super much data or it's like a super performance critical application, then you might want to, you know, work in binary or work in assembly, or, you know, but for this, definitely we can just use spreading. I don't think there's any even the slightest performance overhead would make 0 difference to our users or ourselves in this case. So let's just do that, and you know, let's actually probably take a moment here to look at this ID. So we actually want to create a unique ID, and how do we do that? There's a lot of options. We got a lot of options to do this. So there's something called UUID, and that is probably the most well-known unique ID, and it's definitely guaranteed to be unique. So universally unique ID. So I think chance of the chance of a collision here is 1 collision in 2.7 quintillion. So that should give you an idea. Maybe not if you don't know what quintillion, like me, you don't know what quintillion means, but I bet it's got probably quite a lot of zeros, you know. So this is equivalent to generating around 1 billion UUIDs per second for about 85 years. So if that doesn't tell you about it, then I don't know. So this UUID is pretty damn nice, you know. It's pretty unique. So the chance of a duplication here is very low. I don't think we need to worry about it at all. If it does happen, we should probably go buy ourselves a lottery ticket, because then we are lucky, or maybe we consider ourselves unlucky if our application crashes. But let's just use this. I think there's a package for this as well. So npm UUID. So if you don't know, the npm, like we installed Vite with it, it is the package manager for the Node environment. So it's probably, yeah, no, you know, this is where you could install your packages. I think you can install them from other places as well, but this is definitely the most well-known platform to do that from. So we just have to install this with npm and then require this package here and then like import a function, and then we got ourselves a unique ID. So I think it's pretty straightforward. And we can, you know, when it comes to these dependencies, we want to check out, do they look serious? Do they look used? So we can see weekly downloads is like almost 300,000. I think that tells a pretty good story about it being used. We can see it's used by 94.3 thousand. You know, I don't think that we have anything to worry about. So let's just go ahead and install that. Let's just open a new terminal because we don't want to, you know, terminate our development server. So let's just install UUID and let's see here. So yeah, so let's just import that. So if you use TypeScript like we do, we can import this here and that should be fine. So import that function, and let's see, maybe it's not got that. Oh, I installed the wrong package. That's not good. What is the syntax for removing a package? Maybe npm remove. Yeah, so that should be fine. I'm just removing whatever I just installed, but UUID v4. Let's see if that helped us. No, I don't think. Maybe it's some weird catch thing, or maybe not. I'm not sure. Maybe we just need to restart the maybe we just need to restart the server here. So let's see if that works. Oh, that's not good. That does not look good. Well. I did not read the description well enough here. So that is definitely worth thinking about, you know. Please note, you know, maybe we could like add an emoji here or make this a little bit bigger. I kind of missed this, but you know, it's my own fault here. So if you saw this, feel free to comment that, because I'm very ignorant here and not reading the description of whatever I'm installing. So I actually installed the right package. Maybe it was some subconscious thing telling me that this is actually the real package. So let's remove the v4 one and install UUID instead. Let's see here. So this UUID, it should be, you know, we got 51,000 there, I think. It is also super good. There's no issues. We got even more. My bad. You know, when it comes to npm, you should not be holding down on your numbers here. We can see 85 million weekly downloads. So this is definitely being used. So let's see if that helps us import it. Now deprecated. Let's try to read this. We just import v4 as UUID v4. Let's see, and that actually worked, so no worries there. So this little deprecation here actually saved us from using something deprecated. So that is props to the library maintainers for doing that. So now we should actually be able to use this function UUID v4 to generate a new ID for us. So let's see if that works. Okay, maybe I need to restart my server again. There we go. So now I can actually add some new items. It's not that amazing. So we can also delete some items. We got that covered in the last episode. So let's add some more. You can see we can verify here that it pretty much works as we expected. That is pretty amazing, you know. And this code looks pretty clean to my eye. You know, we got this title here. We got this spreading here. We are, you know, this looks pretty straightforward to me. You know, we have this title and then we're assigning an empty string to it, which clears it, you know. So I think it's pretty clear code. It doesn't do anything weird that we can't decipher from looking at it. So that's pretty nice. So like I said, we might want to reconsider how we handle the state of our application in the future. This items array, we might not want to put this here, but that's like a future question for now. So let's not think too much about this, because then we just get demotivated and then we don't work on the project because we're thinking too much about all of these performance or best practices and all of that. So let's just keep it that way for now. If it becomes a problem in the future, we will handle it then, just like every developer always says. So what have we got now? Well, we've got this nice functionality of adding items, but now we got a problem here, because we don't want this ID to be like a weird number. We want it to always be numbers. So we're probably just gonna clear this default value here, so we can actually add some items without, we don't have to depend on this weird developer bias of buy some cookies twice. No, we just want an empty array here, so we can add whatever we want, just like these random characters here. So now we got that. We can see. Okay, so one thing here I noticed, this does not look good. We need to solve that, and the reason for that is that we're doing some weird spell checking that is enabled on the span here. So I think it's called just spell check. Yeah, so we can set this to false, and that should solve our problem. So if I try to change this now, we can see there's this as is not a valid word, but it's all fine to Firefox here telling me it's okay, because we set spell check here to false, of course. So that's pretty neat now. So let's think about what we want to implement now. I think we actually want to implement like a basic modal. So we want to have this modal so that we can edit a task. So this edit button here, when we click this, we want to like add like a pop-up here with some like graying out the background. like show some properties of this item. We don't have any properties really right now, so we're probably only gonna change the title or something. You know, we're gonna add a lot of options in the future for that. So let's just create a good fundamental, like minimum viable product kind of vibe to it. So let's actually create a modal component. So now I can already see it kind of becomes kind of messy here if I were to put this modal here. So I'm not really sure what the convention here is. I think lib is actually for like external libraries. I'm not really sure. So let's Google it. So lib folder svelte, maybe lib folder can do the same project structure. Here we actually got something. Oh, well, that is svelte kit. Library code, utilities and components. Well, okay. Maybe I'm not following the best practice the best way. Okay, let's just put it in components. Let's skip the whole lib thing. So let's just do something like item, I think. So this will be for to do items. That is pretty much what what we're doing here. So let's move that there, and then let's create a new folder here for modal. So let's create a modal folder, move that into components, and let's see if there's a problem here yet. So this is a relative path there that does not work out anymore. Let's see if that broke everything. Yeah, got some pesky relative paths here. Even more apparently. It never ends to do item create. Okay, app.svelte actually. So this should be in components. Well, okay. Maybe VS Code could be a little bit nicer here. Just moving this, we should change these paths, but maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I did it the wrong way. I'm not sure. So there we go. Is that fine? Yeah, it seems to be fine now. Okay, so that is also a thing we probably want to make sure we don't do. So if it's empty, we don't want to allow submitting that. So let's just do that real quick. It's super simple actually. Since we're doing with Svelte, everything is super straightforward. So if title is empty, then we just return early as well. So we could put this on the same line, but I think these have kind of different responsibilities. So I think it's nice to keep it clear to whoever's reading this code that these are not related at all. So whenever I press like enter without typing anything, it is not allowing me to do that, and that's pretty nice. So we got that going there. So what were we doing? We are doing a modal. So let's actually create a new component here called modal.svelte here, and this will be for rendering the modal. Now there are like very many ways to do this. There's actually something we're going to be discovering today that is called conditional rendering. At least that's what I think it's called. So Svelte conditional rendering. Well, if blocks, So if blocks are super cool in Svelte. They exist in other languages as well, but they're super cool in Svelte as well. So this if block simply, this code is only rendered if this boolean here, if this statement is matched. So just like we have like a normal if statement in JavaScript, whenever I put if, all the code inside will only run if the statement is true. The difference with Svelte here is that all of the code that is inside of the if statement will only be rendered if the statement is true. So that also changes. So if this variable changes, it will start rendering it. If it just changed to false, then it will no longer render it. So it's super cool. It works super well. So that's what we're going to be using for our modal here. I think that is the best practice. I think that's the way to do it. We could like do it inside of whatever the parent component is as well, but that looks pretty bad, So we would have like multiple if statements for that case. So we could have like in whatever this will be. I think we'll put this in app.svelte. Yeah. So if I had like multiple modals, I would have like an if statement and then put the modal inside of that. But let's just put it in the modal for now. But we're actually not going to put it in the actual modal.svelte. So the modal.svelte is going to be like the base class, but the base component really for the modal. So this modal will be shown inside another Svelte component, which will actually be the real modal. So this like naming here might actually be a bit more actually, yeah, let's create something called util. So this util folder will only contain, the util component. So this is like a util component. It doesn't really have anything to do with this specific business logic or whatever you call it, the specific, like use case of the application. It's just for like utility. So let's actually create a new folder here again, which is called modal, and this will actually contain the application modals. So let's create something called edit task modal. So this will be for editing a to-do item, a to-do task. So here we will be rendering the modal. So we will do something like this, and inside here we will put the content of the modal, and that is a feature I will be showing you guys today as well. So the idea here is kind of that I put an if statement around this modal, so it will only be rendered when the statement is true. So let's try that for now. Let's just do something like visible is false, and if, let's copy that code there. If visible, then we want to render. If it's not visible, it's not, rendering. Then it will only show that. So let's just do something hello world here. So if I were to put this edit task modal here, we can see nothing is being rendered because visible is false. But if I were to set it to true, we can see hello world. So that is our conditional rendering. And of course, this changes as the variable changes. So I could have like a toggle here. So that's kind of the point here. Whenever this variable changes, it will show the modal. And if we have like a close button, then the close button will change the variable so that it no longer renders. So that is kind of the point of that. But for this, we're actually going to be needing to add something inside of here. And for that, we're going to be using something called slots. And slots are amazing in Svelte. So slots actually allow us to put code, actually like put real HTML code and other components inside another component, like dynamically. So we have like a slot inside of here. All of the code that I put between these two tags will be rendered like based on how I put the slot here. So I'm not sure if that made any sense, but I will be demonstrating that for you now. So if I just do something like slot, this is the way to do it. You do a slot like a slot tag, and notice that this is like lowercase, so it's not a component, it's like a Svelte syntax way. So there's multiple like tags here that are special in Svelte that we will be discovering later, but we can see already that it actually worked. So this text content is being passed here in the parent component. So we're passing some content here. We could actually like put a h1 tag, we can put whatever we want here. I think maybe we can even put a modal inside of here. I'm not sure if that nesting is allowed. Yeah, it is. So I'm having a modal inside of a modal. So we have modal overload here, but I'm trying to get the point across that whatever I put inside between these two tags is actually being rendered here. And with this tag, we can actually, control how we want to render it, of course. So if I were to have like a div here and do something to this div, like background color red, then we can see that works still, of course, So we can just put a slot wherever we want to have it, and then it just renders the HTML under it. So that's pretty cool. I love this feature of Svelte. So we're going to use this to have some content for our modals. And the reason I'm doing this is because the modal will be it will be using two components. So it will be using two dividers. So I'm actually using the one from We3 Schools. I think it's pretty good. So modal, if I search for modal, I think it's the first HTML modal. I think it's the first search result. Yeah, I can see this. So pretty good. It really works out for me. I've used it in a lot of projects and it always works. So the idea here is that we have a modal, and this is actually the modal background. So let's copy that. Not copy it. We're gonna create our isolated CSS, of course. So this modal class here. So we're gonna call it something like modal BG instead. So this will be the background of the modal. You can see, we stay in place. We have like this position fixed, makes it on like the page. With the set index here, we can actually control it to be rendered like in front of other elements on the page. There's some other things like left and top to make it positioned nicely and width and height, of course. And then we have this background color as well with some opacity here. So if I were to have 100% opacity, it would just be like a black background here. So if I could show you guys that. So if I were to do something like modal BG, well, that did not work for some reason. Maybe I need content. Wait, what happened here? Did that not work or what? Well, that was anticlimactic, I guess. It's not being rendered. So, okay. So they got some weird hidden by default. We don't want that. There we go. We love that black background hiding everything on the page. No. So let's just bring that back to 0.4. We can see, we got that kind of nice fade here. So the content is still visible, but we can see that whatever I put, then you put like a super white modal, and then the modal looks like it's coming out of the page, So you get that nice feel there. So let's add that modal as well. Let's call that modal instead for the class. And then we can use that here. So let's copy that code as well. Not there. I'm not sure what that was about. So modal, and then we copy it here. So there we go. Now if I put some content here, well, we can just put the slot here. So that is my idea here. So we put the slot here. Whatever the user writes here will be visible here. There we go. We got our first modal going. Isn't that amazing? It looks pretty nice, Maybe we can have some routing later or some fancy modern looking design. But for now, I think that's a pretty decent modal. So let's see. Maybe we can add some title here. Edit task. Yeah, so it looks pretty nice. We can put some content. We can put some buttons. But now we actually want to be closing this modal as well. So whenever I click the background here, I think the default, the modern norm here is whenever I click this background, we want to close it. We're in panic clicking the background because we no longer want to view this modal. That is how it usually goes. So of course, we're also going to have like a button here for closing the modal, but also clicking the background would be pretty nice. So we're actually going to be using an event handler here, of course. So on click, close. So I think we're actually going to be using event dispatchers here as well, because the state that defines if it should be visible or not is actually in the parent here. So the parent needs to know if it's visible or not. Maybe I could bind it. I mean, yeah, why not try that? I guess we could try that as well. If I just bind this visible, but the thing here with it being visible or not also kind of depends on the data I'm using to render it. So what I mean by that is sometimes I'm actually using another variable. I'm not using a boolean here. I'm using an object. So that is kind of a weird routine or habit I've got going. I put some data here instead. So instead of having like a boolean here, I put, of course still a boolean, but I do if it is null. So I have an object. So I have like some data that I want to show. This is especially true here as well, So this task here, now I can show that. So whenever I create a task here, when I click this edit button, I would need to have the data. So like edit task as dash or edit task by some cookies. We need to know the information about the task that we are editing, of course. So, we can kind of get around that by still just having two variables, one for the data and one for being visible or not. I'm just kind of lazy, I guess. That's why I just have one variable. So let's just try the two-way data binding approach and see if it looks good or not. We can just go back anyways later. So if we just bind the visible here, then we can actually create a property here, of course. So and export that and make the default value here false, of course. Let's see if that works. Yeah, so let's actually make this true here. I think that will actually make it still false because, so this is being changed inside of here. Yeah, wait, never mind. Yeah, so here we set it to true. So you can see it's visible now. Whenever I click the background, I want it to no longer be visible. So we're gonna create a close function here. And this close function will be setting the visible variable to false again. So whenever I click the background here, it is being closed. So that is pretty nice, isn't it? Problematic side effect is that whenever I click anything here, it also calls this. So the problem with that is that this event is, I think it's called bubble up. So this event is bubbled. So whenever I click that child component, which it is, this modal here is a child of modal BG. So whenever I click this modal here, that click event also occurs inside of the background, of course, because we're part of the modal BG. This modal is part of that. So that click event is also forwarded up to the modal BG, and we don't want that. So one way to do that is by using something called stop propagation, and that stops that click event from being propagated up to the parent element. So we can actually use something like event modifiers, I think they're called in Svelte. So we used to find this, but then we use this character, which I'm not really sure what it's called, on click. We can see these event modifiers here. So there's, you might have heard about this before, prevent default and stop propagation as well. So stop propagation simply prevents that event from propagating to the, prevents the event from reaching the next element. So the next element in this case is the parent element. So whenever I press this, it should actually not do that. Let's see. Yeah. So whenever I press now here, when I click on this background, or when I click on this modal content, it no longer closes the modal, which is what we want. So that is pretty nice. So now we got our modal going. I think we also want to have like a super simple button here. So we just try that out as well. So close here on click. We can do something like close. So function close. Then we set visible to false. Whenever I click close, we can see it still closes. So that that works pretty nice, So yeah, maybe we actually want to put this if statement inside of the modal. I'm not really sure about this. It's all about personal preference here, how you want your code to look. But maybe we want to do that. I'm not really sure. Maybe in the future we'll get different thoughts about that. So I'm being pretty impulsive here and just putting it right now there because I got a big feel for it. But let's see, if I were to remove that, then it would look pretty nice here, I'm not saying that isn't. We still have the same functionality, of course. So that's pretty neat, I guess. I'm not really sure. Maybe we will see a different use case for keeping it in here in the future. But of course, we want to keep our logic as generic as possible. We want to put it in where it belongs, and rendering it the modal, if controlling that is kind of the responsibility of the modal itself, and not the modal, like the parent modal or whatever you call it. So I think this makes pretty much sense. So now we can actually edit the task. And what do we want to edit? Well, I think we can just add a simple input type text here. So this will be for editing the task title. And now, like I said, we want to actually get the data from the task. So we will be having to define something like export let data and then task here. So we want to have a task. Okay, we need our TypeScript, of course. So task here, import that. Then we see we can bind here the value of this input here to data.title. Let's see if that works. Okay, that seems to work. Yeah, so now we want to set this to false here, of course. We don't want that to be showing up whenever we enter the site. Let's see here. So now when we click this edit button here, we actually want to open the modal. So let's do something like on click here as well. So on click on delete, I guess. So let's create that function as well. On edit. No, we don't want on delete. I meant on edit, of course. So on edit. Dispatch. Then we dispatch edit. Let's see here. We got this to do item, I think. So we want to use event forwarding. Like I said before, we can forward this event to the parent component if we don't define a handler for it. So on edit, this forwards it to the parent component, which in our case is to do items.svelte. So I think actually here we want to forward it even more actually. So, well, yeah, I guess maybe not. So the problem here is that we need to forward the information about the item itself. So we can actually use this temporary variable here as well. So on edit, we can have this anonymous function here to do something like dispatch. So we need to create an event dispatcher here as well. So let's create that there, and then we can dispatch here, dispatch edit item. So see if we import that as well. So if we now go to app.svelte, we should be able to use on edit, on task edit, and then we use the E here again. So we actually want to get data from this child component. So whatever the data we pass in here, like I showed previously, we pass it in here. So this detail here we actually want to get from the child. So let's do on task edit, and we can see, I'm not really sure if I showed you guys this. So to get the data, we actually do something like called e.detail. So the property detail actually contains the value that we pass in here. So this item here is the detail. So we can even see that here. So detail here will be the property. So let's see if that works. So now we actually want to have the data. So now we gotta do something pretty ugly, I think. So we gotta do something like edit task modal data or something like that. That should also, we kind of need to annotate this more properly. So this can also be null, of course. So let's do something like that. Maybe it will complain, I'm not sure. So when I go back here now, we can actually do data here is edit task modal data. So whenever that variable changes, we get that in the edit task modal as well as the data. So now when I do on task edit, we actually want to change this variable here, but we also need to change the visibility. So like I said, this is kind of why I made it only one variable, because now I need to have two variables to keep track of this. Maybe I could have like an object for that, I'm not sure, but let's just make it two for now. So edit task modal visible should be false for now. So let's see here, visible, does that exist? Yeah, it does not. So we want that to be exported, of course, as a prop. So now, let's see if I can get the detail here. Whenever I press the edit button here, we can see, yeah, so we got this object here. This is our task object of the task that we press the edit button on. So now we actually want to pass that data to the edit task modal. And it's very important here that when we do this, we actually clone the values. The value that we're editing here should not be the same like reference to that item, because then we will be editing an item that we're potentially not interested in saving. So we might make a change to this task that we're not that happy with, and then we close the modal, and then all of a sudden that change is applied, and we don't want that. So I can show you guys what I mean with that. So let's just do edit task modal visible is true. Well, I think we should set the data here, of course, first, because it kind of depends on that. So let's set that to e.detail. And see if that works out when I press the edit button, edit task. So there we go. So whenever I press that button, you can even see here that this task title here is represented beautifully. So, but whenever I change this, this would actually change the internal value, I think. So if I were to console log that somewhere, maybe, so JSON.string, I'm not really sure if that, I don't think that will be reactive anyways, actually. So let's just make a button for it as usual. So log on click, we will console log items. So we can see now if I create a new task and edit this, and now I close this module, and I press log, we can see that this change has been reflected, even though we don't want that. So we need to make sure that we clone the value, so we don't have the same object flying to the modal. And there's a super easy way to do that nowadays. So there's something called structured clone, I think, which does that. So it's pretty nice. I think this is pretty recent. People need some time to update their browsers, of course, but for now, I think it's fine to use this. I think it's pretty much standard nowadays. So there actually used to be like a really hellish way of doing this, where you actually used something like JSON stringify and JSON parse. So you like stringify the object first, and then you parse it back in an object. So that was one way of cloning an object before, and that is really, really strange and looked super, super funny, you know. So it was also kind of inefficient. You know, it wasn't super inefficient, but this structured clone I think is actually much faster than this JSON cloning thing that we got before. So we actually want to use structured clone for this. So if I go to app.svelte, we just do something like structured clone, and it should not be changing that. So it was kind of a shame I deleted that. See if that still works. So whenever I change this, so okay, maybe not. Structured clone. So whenever I edit this now, hello world, and I close this modal and I press the log button, moment of truth, we can see it's still as we wanted. So no worries there, no damage done. All with the help of structured clone. So that's pretty neat. So I'm not really sure about this edit task modal visible yet. I think it kind of looks weird for now, but we'll see about the best practices there later. So now when we go to this edit task modal, we actually want to be able to save this. So I'm just gonna create a super simple modal for now where we can just do the same thing like we did here, where we change this title here and it is reflected in the data. So let's just create a button for that as well called like save. So let's create a function here, save as well, and then we probably want to do something like an event dispatcher, our beloved event dispatchers as usual. So we create a new dispatcher, dispatch this changed value, I think. Or maybe not actually, maybe, yeah, okay, let's do that, yeah. So let's just dispatch that save. So we dispatch this save event when we save the changes. So let's just pass in data here, and that should contain the changed values. And let's see now in app.svelte if we can create an event handler for that. So on task edit save or something like that. Then we can bind, well, you know, bind to this event here on save on task edit save, and then we should be able to get that from e.detail. So e.detail should contain the changed task. So whenever I change this here, save that there, we can see it is being reflected. Yeah, it is being reflected. So now we actually want to change this in the array. So the way to do that is actually, I think since we want to reassign it, I think one of the most easier to read versions, you can still do these weird splicing and like messing around with that, but one of the pretty nice ways to do this is by using map. So with map you can actually change the values in an array while iterating over it. So you can like reassign an object to something else, mapping it. We're mapping data and changing it. So when we map this object, we can actually map it to the new changed object if the ID matches. So let's check that out. So items is items.map. Now we got the current value, so the task value. And then we want to return here, we want to return the new transformed value. So if v.id equals e.detail.id, then we want to set it as e.detail. So we set it to the new value, we transform it, we map it to the new value. Otherwise, we map it to the current or previous value or whatever you want to call it. So that should actually work, I think. And it looks pretty readable, None of these edit solutions are that readable, but I think it looks somewhat readable. You can document this code as well, add a comment here that describes what it does. So whenever I save this now, it should actually be reflected here as well. And we can see it actually worked. That looks pretty nice, doesn't it? So whenever I change this and save it, we can see it actually changes here. So it's also kind of important that we close the modal, but we have got this amazing function here. So we can just call that here on save. So close as well. Then I change it, save, and there we go. That is pretty nice. So now I can add some items. I can change some items as well. Isn't that amazing? So now we got some amazing functionality implemented. This was a pretty long episode, in fact, but we got a lot of things covered. Maybe not that much progress, but we learned a lot about Svelte. We discussed a lot about best practices, of course. So in the next episode, I think we'll be looking at some ways to store this data. So it's kind of important that we are able to have a representation. We have this model here that we can like represent it. We actually want to store it somewhere so that it persists. So whenever I reload this page, I want it to persist. So there's some couple of methods to do this locally, you know. Then in the future, we will also be creating a backend for this application. So it's kind of important that we also have a backend, of course. So we'll be looking at different languages, different programming languages, in fact, different backend solutions to have our backend running on, where we can actually have like a database for storing this. That is probably the most best practice way of storing it, you know, not locally, but it depends on your use case, you know. Maybe you want to save this to a file or something super cool. So we'll be definitely looking at different ways to save this data in the next episode. And of course, I also forgot about the one thing here. So as we can see, we also have this completed flag here. So definitely we're gonna be looking at that in the next episode so that we can complete tasks. So like I have a checkbox here. When I check this checkbox, this changes, you know, all of that good stuff that we expect from a to-do application. So I'm very proud of you guys for watching here to the end. I hope you guys got some amazing to-do applications going now. So feel free to comment how it's going. Feel free to comment if you have any questions, if you caught me doing something stupid, you know. So feel free to subscribe if you want to be part of this community that I'm building so that we can share code together and learn from each other. It would be amazing. So thank you guys a lot for watching and peace out.